Luke Darnell hit the dirt hard, the impact rattling through his ribs like a dropped toolbox. The rocky ground of Grell 9 wasn't forgiving, and the wound across his thigh wasn't exactly a scratch. Blood soaked through the torn fabric of his pants, pooling beneath him in a worryingly fast spread. Above him, the squat, gray-skinned alien named Jorvax flailed 2 of his 6 arms in pure panic. "You are hemorrhaging vitals. Remain still. Emergency extraction must be commenced immediately." Luke grit his teeth and propped himself up on his elbows. "It's not that bad." Jorvax emitted a high-pitched whine that Luke had learned meant absolute terror. "Your dermal layer is compromised beyond 70%. Internal fluids are evacuating at an alarming rate. You are facing imminent expiration." Luke glanced down at his leg. It was deep, no doubt about that, and it hurt like hell, but the way Jorvax was reacting, you'd think he had minutes left to live. He wiped a bit of blood off his forehead and sighed. "I'll sleep it off and be fine." Jorvax froze, all 6 eyes blinking rapidly. "Sleep it off." Luke nodded, trying to smile but mostly grimacing. "Yeah, just need a little rest. Humans are tough like that." Jorvax turned to the other aliens clustered nearby, muttering hurriedly in their chirpy, garbled language. One of them, a taller, mint-colored one named HFY, held a scanner that beeped ominously every time it passed over Luke's leg. "His internal matrix is destabilizing," HFY said, clearly horrified. "He must be placed in cryostasis for preservation." Luke shook his head. "No freezer pods. Just get me back to camp. Wrap it up tight, give me some water, and I'll be good." The aliens hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. None of them seemed willing to argue with a dying man about how he wanted to die. Jorvax finally snapped into action, lifting Luke with surprising gentleness. Luke grunted, the movement sending a firebolt of pain through his whole side. He clenched his jaw, determined not to pass out. The last thing he needed was these guys embalming him alive out of goodwill. The ride back to camp was a blur. Luke was placed on a hover sled, and the rough, bouncing journey made every jolt feel like a sledgehammer to his leg. Jorvax hovered over him, fretting about bone fractures, septic cascades, and cellular collapse. By the time they reached the medical tent, Luke was sweating buckets and barely coherent. HFY tried to scan him again, but Luke waved him off weakly. "Just bandage it," Luke mumbled. "Then let me sleep." The medical officer, a blue-skinned alien named Vetra, was less inclined to humor him. She pulled out a field kit, rummaged through it, and produced a thick roll of bandages and a bottle of antiseptic that smelled like burnt rubber. "This will sting," Vetra warned. Luke grunted. "Already stings." Vetra poured the antiseptic directly into the wound. Luke's back arched off the cot as a white-hot bolt of agony shot through him. He bit down on his sleeve so hard he thought he might rip it apart. "You see," Jorvax cried, arms wringing in distress. "He is convulsing. His end is nigh." Luke managed to gasp. "That's normal. It just hurts." Vetra worked quickly, cleaning the wound and wrapping it in thick, slightly sticky bandages. When she was done, Luke felt like his entire leg was encased in cement. He tried to move it and immediately regretted it. "Stay immobile," Vetra ordered. "You have lost significant blood. Your internal repair mechanisms must be given time to function." Luke gave a weak thumbs up and closed his eyes. The aliens watched him as though he might evaporate any second. He drifted into a fitful sleep, waking hours later to the sound of whispered arguments. "He has ceased movement," HFY hissed. "Respiratory rate has decreased by 30%, Jorvax whispered back. "Commence morning protocols." Another alien said. Luke groaned and cracked an eye open. "I'm not dead." The cluster of aliens jumped back a foot. "Holy stars," Jorvax yelped. "He reactivates." Luke tried to sit up but only managed a half-hearted flop. "Water," Jorvax scrambled to hand him a canteen. Luke drank greedily, the cool liquid reviving him a little. "You see," he croaked, "just needed some sleep." The aliens crowded closer, peering at him with a mixture of awe and horror. "You have self-repaired?" HFY asked, voice trembling. "Not all the way," Luke admitted. "Still hurts like hell, probably should get some stitches." Vetra stepped forward, scanning his leg again. The wound is stabilizing. You require sutures and extended rest. Minimum 7 cycles of recovery. Luke nodded. Sounds about right. For the next few days, Luke stayed mostly immobile, propped up on the cot while the aliens hovered around him like worried nurses. They brought him food, checked his bandages obsessively, and asked endless questions about human biology. You can survive blood loss of up to 30%, Jorvax asked one afternoon, scribbling furiously on a datapad. Yeah, Luke said, picking at the bland ration bar they gave him. Any more than that and it gets dicey. And physical trauma, how do you endure such pain? Luke shrugged. We just do, not like we have a choice. The aliens exchanged glances as if unable to comprehend such a philosophy. One morning, about a week later, Luke tried standing. His leg protested violently, sending sharp pains up his side, but he managed to hobble a few steps with the help of a crutch Vetra had improvised out of spare piping. Jorvax's 6 eyes widened. He ambulates, Luke chuckled weakly. Gotta move, can't just lie around forever. You are not fully repaired, HFY protested. Still gotta move, Luke said stubbornly. Muscles'll waste away if I don't. The aliens watched him limp around the tent, clearly torn between admiration and horror. Later that day, an alarm blared through the camp. Luke hobbled to the entrance and saw a dust storm barreling toward them, the sky turning a sickly green. Reinforce the shelters, Vetra barked. The aliens scrambled to obey. Luke spotted a few struggling with the heavy support beams and, despite the throbbing in his leg, moved to help. You must not, Jorvax cried. You risk destabilizing your repair. Luke gritted his teeth and lifted one end of a sagging beam. Don't care. Not gonna let the whole camp blow away. Together, they secured the tent just as the storm hit, battering the camp with furious winds and stinging sand. Luke collapsed back onto his cot afterward, utterly spent. You are resilient beyond expectation, HFY said, sounding almost reverent. Luke laughed weakly. Nah, just stubborn. The days dragged on. Luke's leg healed slowly but steadily. The aliens took to studying his recovery like it was a religious experience. They recorded every milestone, the first time he walked unaided, the first time he jogged a few steps, the first time he lifted something heavy without wincing. A month after the injury, Luke was nearly back to normal. His leg still ached sometimes, especially when the weather turned cold, but he could move around the camp without much trouble. One evening, as he sat by the fire pit with Jorvax and HFY watching the twin moons rise, Jorvax turned to him. Your species, he said solemnly, possesses an extraordinary capacity for survival. Luke poked the fire with a stick, sending a plume of sparks into the air. We're not the strongest or the fastest, we're just good at not giving up. HFY tilted his head. Is that your primary evolutionary advantage? Luke thought about it. Yeah, probably. The aliens sat in thoughtful silence for a long time. Then Jorvax said, We have much to learn from you. Luke smiled, feeling the lingering ache in his leg and the warmth of the fire against his face. And I've got a lot to learn from you too. The night deepened around them, the stars bright and endless. Luke leaned back, letting the quiet settle over him. For once, he wasn't the strange one. He was just another creature trying to make it through another day, and somehow that was enough. The wind had mostly died down by the next morning, leaving a heavy grit in the air that clung to Luke's teeth, no matter how much water he drank. He sat outside the medical tent, his injured leg stretched out stiffly before him, while Jorvax hovered nearby with a battered-looking notebook jammed full of scribbles. How often does your kind undergo tissue regeneration without external intervention? Jorvax asked, tapping his stylus against the page with a nervous twitch. Luke shifted his weight carefully. All the time, scrapes, cuts, broken bones. Bodies just get on with it. Jorvax tilted his head, the crest on his scalp fluttering slightly. And you require no mechanical assistance, maybe a splint or some stitches if it's bad enough, but mostly, yeah. Luke wiped his mouth and grimaced at the taste of dust. We heal the old-fashioned way. HFY approached from the supply tent, carrying a tray with a steaming mug and a small bowl. He set them down in front of Luke with deliberate care. "Protein infusion and hydration supplement," HFY announced. "Optimized for your nutritional deficiency." Luke eyed the bowl warily. "What's in it?" "High-density amino chains, fermented algal matter, and synthesized lipid clusters." Luke blew on the mug and took a cautious sip. It tasted vaguely like warm seawater mixed with chalk. "Not exactly Mom's chicken soup." Jorvax scribbled furiously. "Chicken soup. Traditionally administered during human illness. More for comfort than for healing," Luke said, setting the mug down before his stomach changed its mind about the contents. Vetra emerged from the tent behind them, carrying a small cylindrical device. She pressed a button and a soft hum filled the air. Luke felt a tingling sensation crawl up his leg. "Diagnostic pulse," Vetra said. Checking for microfractures. Luke winced as the sensation intensified around his knee. "Feels like ants tap dancing on my bones. Bone integrity at 87%, Vetra announced after a moment. "Acceptable for limited mobility." Luke let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good, sitting around's driving me nuts." Jorvax peered at him. "Your tolerance for inactivity is remarkably low." "Humans aren't built for sitting still," Luke said. "We get restless." HFY pulled a small folding chair from a nearby stack and set it beside Luke. He sat awkwardly, knees bending the wrong way compared to a human's. "Inactivity is highly valued in many civilizations. It conserves energy and minimizes risk." Luke chuckled. "Yeah, well, tell that to my brain. It starts inventing problems if I don't keep busy." A gust of wind sent a fresh wave of dust swirling across the camp. Luke shielded his eyes and cursed under his breath. "We should reinforce the perimeter," he said, nodding toward the sagging outer barriers. HFY hesitated. "You are not authorized for strenuous activity." Luke pushed himself up using the crutch, grunting as his leg protested. "I'm not lifting anything heavy, just supervising." Jorvax looked unconvinced but didn't try to stop him. They made their way to the perimeter, where several aliens were struggling to tie down a flapping section of tarpaulin. Luke watched for a few minutes, noting how the ropes were too loose and the anchors poorly spaced. "Bring that line lower," Luke called out. "Anchor it at an angle, not straight down. You want it to pull tight when the wind hits." The aliens blinked at him, then hurried to adjust the ropes. "Humans appear to possess instinctual structural engineering aptitude," Jorvax muttered, scribbling again. Luke leaned on the crutch and grinned. "Nah, just common sense." The work went faster with his guidance. Within an hour, the perimeter was secured better than it had been even before the storm. Luke's leg throbbed fiercely by the time they finished, but he hid his limp as best he could on the way back. Later that afternoon, while Luke rested in the shade of a cargo crate, HFY approached carrying a small, boxy device. "We have developed an exo support frame to assist your mobility," HFY said, holding it out like a peace offering. Luke eyed it suspiciously. "What's it do?" "Distributes load bearing stress away from the injured limb," HFY explained. "Minimizes strain during ambulation." Luke sighed. "All right, let's give it a shot." Fitting the device took some effort. It clamped around his thigh and calf with soft but firm bands, and a flexible rod ran along the outside of his leg, absorbing some of the pressure when he stood. He took a tentative step. The brace hummed quietly, and the pain in his leg dulled to a manageable ache. "I could get used to this," he admitted. Jorvax beamed, all 6 arms fluttering with excitement. "We have successfully augmented human resilience," Luke laughed. "Don't get ahead of yourselves. This thing's just a crutch with delusions of grandeur." As evening fell, the camp gathered around the central fire pit, a nightly ritual that Luke had come to appreciate. The aliens exchanged news, told stories, and sometimes sang strange, lilting songs in languages Luke couldn't understand. Tonight, though, the mood was different. There was a tension in the air, a crackle of anticipation. Vetra stood and addressed the group. Tomorrow, a survey team will depart to investigate anomalous readings in the southern canyon. Volunteers are requested. Luke's ears perked up. He knew better than to volunteer outright. His leg was still far from 100%, but he also didn't want to be left behind. He leaned toward Jorvax. "How rough is the terrain down there?" "Unstable," Jorvax said. "Rock slides, unpredictable magnetic fields, and potential geothermal vents." Luke nodded slowly. "Sounds like fun. You should not participate," HFY said bluntly. "Your structural integrity remains compromised." "I'll think about it," Luke said, knowing full well he wouldn't. The next morning, just before dawn, the survey team assembled at the edge of camp. Luke limped up, clad in a reinforced jacket and the exo support frame, carrying a light pack slung over one shoulder. Vetra spotted him immediately. "You are not cleared for field operation." Luke shrugged. "Not planning to sprint any marathons. I'll hang back, monitor equipment. You'll need someone who understands human tech if anything breaks." Vetra narrowed her eyes but said nothing. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. The team set out across the rocky plain, the rising sun casting long shadows behind them. Luke kept pace surprisingly well, the exo frame doing most of the heavy lifting. By midday, they reached the mouth of the canyon. The ground sloped steeply downward, jagged rocks jutting out at odd angles. A low, sulfurous smell hung in the air. "Radiothermal activity detected," HFY announced, scanning the area with a handheld device. Luke eyed the unstable ground warily. One misstep here could mean a long, painful tumble. They moved carefully, picking their way along narrow ledges and around bubbling vents. Luke's leg ached fiercely, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. At one point, a loose rock gave way under HFY's foot. Luke lunged forward instinctively, grabbing the alien's arm and hauling him back to solid ground. HFY stared at him, astonished. "You endangered your own stability to preserve mine." Luke wiped his hands on his jacket. "Couldn't just let you fall." They pressed deeper into the canyon, the heat rising around them like a living thing. Eventually, they found the source of the anomaly. A cluster of strange, crystalline growths erupting from the canyon floor, pulsing faintly with inner light. Vetra knelt down, examining one of the crystals with a scanner. Unknown composition, potentially hazardous. Luke crouched beside her, grimacing as his injured leg protested. "Looks like it's alive." The crystal pulsed again, and a faint vibration ran through the ground. "Back up," Luke said immediately. "Something's not right." Before anyone could react, the ground shuddered violently. A crack split the canyon wall above them, and a shower of rocks rained down. Luke dove forward, tackling Vetra out of the way just as a boulder the size of a small car slammed into the spot where she'd been kneeling. Dust filled the air, choking and blinding. Luke coughed, trying to clear his lungs, and felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his side. When the dust finally settled, Vetra was kneeling beside him, scanning frantically. "You have sustained additional trauma," she said, voice tight with urgency. Luke waved her off weakly. "Just bruised, I've had worse." Jorvax and HFY rushed over, their faces pale. "We must evacuate immediately," Jorvax said. Luke struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the exo frame. "Agreed." The return trip was a blur of pain and determination. Luke's ribs ached with every breath and his leg felt like it was on fire, but he refused to slow down. By the time they staggered back into camp, the sun was setting, painting the sky in bloody streaks across the horizon. Vetra ordered Luke straight into the medical tent. He didn't argue this time. As she patched him up cracked rib, deep bruising, and a fresh scrape along his arm, Jorvax hovered nearby, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. "You repeatedly risked your survival for others," Jorvax said quietly. "Even when your own condition was precarious." Luke grunted as Vetra applied a cold compress to his ribs. "That's just what we do." Jorvax scribbled a final note in his battered notebook. "Humanity's greatest strength is not merely resilience. It is their refusal to abandon one another." Luke chuckled softly. Took you long enough to figure that out. Outside, the camp buzzed with quiet activity, the aliens moving with a new, almost reverent energy. Luke leaned back against the cot, exhausted but content. For once, he thought, maybe being the weird, stubborn human wasn't such a bad thing after all. The camp was unusually still in the early morning haze, a thin veil of mist curling around the equipment stacks and low-built shelters. Luke sat on a crate near the fire pit, wrapping a fresh compression bandage around his ribs with slow, deliberate movements. His hands were steady, but every tug of the bandage made him grit his teeth. Across from him, Jorvax adjusted the fit of a bulky environmental suit, his 6 arms fumbling with the unfamiliar buckles. The clumsy struggle was almost hypnotic to watch, like a spider trying to put on a winter coat. "You sure you want to come along?" Luke asked without looking up. Not exactly a pleasure stroll. Jorvax managed to secure the last strap with a triumphant flourish. "It is critical to observe your field endurance firsthand. Field conditions elicit authentic responses." Luke chuckled under his breath. Authentic's a word for it. Vetra appeared from behind the tent, carrying a battered utility case. Her gait was brisk, but she paused when she noticed Luke rewrapping his ribs. "Improvised medical care again?" she asked. "Didn't want to bother anyone," Luke said, tying off the bandage and flexing experimentally. "Besides, you lot have better things to do than babysit." "You are an anomaly," Vetra said, setting down the case. "Most species would demand continuous monitoring after such trauma." Luke stood carefully, testing his balance. The exo-frame whirred softly, compensating for his weaker leg. "We'd never get anything done if we sat around waiting to feel perfect." HFY approached, carrying a portable scanner slung casually over one shoulder. His green skin looked almost translucent in the morning light. "Seismic activity south of the ridge has increased," HFY said without preamble. "We should reassess the risk before proceeding." Luke tightened the straps on his pack. "Reassess all you want, but if we're going, we're going." Vetra glanced at Jorvax, who adjusted his breathing regulator with a nervous twitch. "Human determination borders on pathological," she muttered. Luke grinned. "Better than pathological hesitation." By mid-morning, the group set off, moving along a narrow path that wound between jagged rock formations. The ground was uneven, and the air smelled faintly of ozone, like a thunderstorm was building somewhere unseen. Luke kept a steady pace, favoring his injured side without slowing too much. His ribs ached with every breath, but he welcomed the pain in a strange way. It meant he was still moving, still alive. Jorvax kept up surprisingly well, despite the bulky suit. Every so often, he would scribble notes on a small datapad strapped to his forearm, muttering observations to himself. "You're not going to write me into some medical journal, are you?" Luke asked after a particularly steep climb. "Your physiology defies numerous established parameters," Jorvax said. "It warrants thorough documentation." Luke laughed, which triggered a sharp jab in his ribs. He winced but kept walking. "Just make sure you spell my name right." Around midday, they reached an outcropping overlooking a wide basin littered with crystalline shards. The ground shimmered in the sun, and faint energy readings buzzed from HFY's scanner. "This area is unstable," Vetra warned, scanning the horizon. "We should collect samples quickly and depart." Luke crouched carefully, examining one of the crystals. It hummed faintly under his gloved hand, vibrating in response to his touch. Jorvax knelt beside him, several arms extended with various instruments. "Caution. Unknown reactive properties." Luke tapped the crystal lightly, watching it pulse. "Sometimes you gotta poke things to learn." A low rumble rolled through the ground, subtle but unmistakable. The group froze, glancing at each other. "That's new," Luke said, straightening up. HFY checked his scanner, frowning. "Localized tremor, shallow depth, potential precursor to larger seismic event." "Which means we move," Vetra said sharply. No one argued. They packed up quickly, storing the collected samples in lead-lined containers. Luke slung one over his shoulder, ignoring the fresh twinge in his side. As they began their return trek, the tremors grew more frequent, the ground vibrating underfoot like a restless animal. Luke adjusted his pace, making sure to stay near Jorvax, who was struggling with the uneven terrain. A sharp crack split the air behind them. Luke turned just in time to see a section of the canyon wall shear off, sending a cascade of rocks tumbling down. "Move!" Luke shouted, grabbing Jorvax and hauling him forward. They stumbled together down the path, rocks bouncing and skidding around them. Luke's injured leg buckled slightly, but the exo frame compensated, keeping him upright. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a plateau above the collapsing section. Luke dropped to one knee, panting, ribs screaming in protest. Jorvax hovered beside him, all 6 arms fluttering in frantic disarray. "You should not have exerted yourself to such an extent," Luke coughed, tasting copper. "Would you rather be a pancake back there?" HFY and Vetra caught up moments later, both of them covered in dust and scratches. Vetra immediately knelt beside Luke, scanning him. "Secondary trauma detected," she said grimly. "Fractured rib likely displaced." Luke pushed her scanner away gently. "I'll manage. You push beyond logical thresholds," Vetra said. "Continued exertion risks systemic collapse." Luke wiped sweat from his brow. "It's not about logic, it's about not leaving anyone behind." Jorvax sat heavily on a nearby rock, looking both overwhelmed and deeply thoughtful. "You willingly endure significant degradation to preserve collective integrity." Luke gave a tired nod. "Pretty much." The return to camp was slower, the group cautious of further collapses. Luke leaned heavily on the exo frame, every step sending jolts of pain through his chest, but he refused to ask for help. By the time they stumbled into camp, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the battered shelters. A few curious onlookers gathered, whispering among themselves as Vetra ordered Luke into the medical tent. Inside, under the harsh white lights, Vetra worked methodically, setting Luke's fractured rib with the aid of a portable stabilizer. The process was brutal, no anesthesia, just a leather strap between his teeth and a lot of gritted determination. When it was over, Vetra wrapped his chest in a rigid support brace and handed him a packet of bitter-tasting electrolyte gel. "You require complete rest," she said firmly, "or your internal structures will fail catastrophically." Luke choked down the gel, grimacing. "I hear you." Later that evening, after the camp had quieted down, Jorvax visited the medical tent, carrying a small, meticulously wrapped bundle. He set it down beside Luke's cot without a word. Luke unwrapped it curiously, revealing a crude but carefully constructed model of the canyon they had just escaped, made entirely from scavenged scrap. "Representation of today's event," Jorvax said. "A token of respect." Luke traced a finger over the tiny figures carved into the model, one of them unmistakably human, standing at the edge of a collapsing ledge. "You didn't have to make this," Luke said quietly. "It is important," Jorvax replied. "Your endurance, your refusal to abandon others, these are not mere curiosities. They are virtues we must understand." Luke leaned back against his cot, feeling the dull, steady ache of his battered body. "You'll figure it out eventually, just takes time." Jorvax tilted his head. "Perhaps. But some lessons are better lived than studied." The camp settled into a peaceful rhythm that night, the fires burning low and the stars wheeling overhead. Luke closed his eyes, the model still resting on his chest, and let the hum of life around him lull him into a deep, dreamless sleep. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just surviving. He was part of something bigger, a stubborn, fragile, determined piece of it. And that, against all odds, felt just about perfect.